just quickly about Dakshin, since many of you probably have never heard of us. Dakshin works primarily in coastal ecosystems. We carry out a lot of ecological research projects as well as social legal studies on coastal policy reforms. We also work in the with traditional fishing communities, looking at fisheries management and livelihood issues. And the broad, basically, our projects are divided into four broad program areas, which is biodiversity resource monitoring, communities and resource governance, a program on reconciliation ecology, which is our only mountain ecosystem program, and an environmental education program. So before I start talking about the CRZ, I quickly want to set the context for what is going on our coasts. So traditionally, coastal spaces have always been considered the domain of fishermen and fisheries. So the resources of our coastal seas, that's what we associate. When you think of a coast, you think of a beach, you think of fish. These are the associations that we make. And the beach space also has a lot of importance to these fishing communities because they use the spaces, they use the space to dry their fish. They also use this space as storage space for their boats. They mend their nets sitting on the beach. And the beach also has a lot of significance for social and cultural perspectives for these traditional fishing communities. And we've heard mentions of traditional fishing communities living in conditions that one would not associate with, say, an environmentally conscious group. But I think what we have to ask ourselves is the same question that even people working in terrestrial systems looking at conservation face, is when you're dealing with a group of people that are struggling on a daily basis to ensure that they have enough to provide for them and their families, then it's very difficult to talk to them about the environment. They first need to take care of themselves. Only then are they in a position to listen to these larger issues that are not threatening their day-to-day lives. And if you're talking about the ecological footprint of the fisheries, also the fact remains is that the fisheries itself is a changing sector with advancements in technologies, with the government's modernization programs. You have the number of trawlers that you see along these coasts have increased tremendously, and this is having an adverse impact on the fisheries resources themselves and also on the livelihoods of these traditional communities who do not practice fishing on such a large scale. So we're comparing tons of fish catch to kilograms of fish catch in the case of traditional communities. And so now the current scenario is you no longer just have these communities living on the coast, they share their space with a lot of activities as well. One being, of course, ports. In 2010, Dakshin conducted a study looking at ports along the coasts of India. And what we found was not just the fact that there's an increasing trend in the number of ports being notified. So ports are broadly classified into major ports and non-major ports. Major ports fall under the jurisdiction of the central government, and non-major ports, which are also called minor ports or intermediate ports, fall in the concurrent list. So they're under the jurisdiction of both the central government, but it is the state governments that are mainly responsible for development and management of these ports. And while the term minor might suggest something, they are minor in neither size nor in the volume of traffic that comes to these ports. And the alarming thing is that there doesn't seem to be a consensus on the number of notified ports that exist and that are proposed in our country. So if you look at the numbers here from the Ministry of Shipping website, from the Department of Shipping, and from our study, the numbers vary from state to state. And also, if you look at the density of ports, we did a quick calculation looking at the coastline of our country, and both including the islands and without including the islands. And if you look at it, you have right now, if you include all the notified ports and existing ports, there is a density of the port density is 28 kilometers. So every 28 kilometers, you have a port that has been proposed or that already exists. And when you talk about ports, you're talking about a lot of space that has been put aside, taken away from traditional communities, from other uses which are non-traditional also. There's a certain space involved. There's also, as we've talked about, a certain amount of pollution involved, especially if these ports aren't managed well, which, let's face it, they usually aren't. So there's a question of pollution, question of impacts, question of restricted access to these areas for traditional communities and fisheries, and there's also a question of the amount of investment going into these ports. And associated with ports also tend to attract a lot of development just because a lot of resource-intensive industries find it more cost-effective to transport resources via sea as opposed to land. So, sorry, before that, this is just we talked about this yesterday, the question of erosion along ports. So this is from a report by the Pondi Citizen Action Network in 2008 about the port in Pondicherry. So if you notice the red line, that's the original shoreline, and if you look to the right-hand side, you will see that there's a certain amount of sand depletion and sand accretion on this end. So what happened inevitably was they built a seawall which stopped the erosion but transferred the erosion from Pondicherry to Tamil Nadu, solving no one's problem. Which is what tends to happen with state governments, is you deal with the problem in your own backyard by dumping it into your neighbors, which is not really an answer. So like I was saying, associated industries, one major industry that comes up when you have a port, are thermal power plants, because they find it easier to transport their coal. And thermal power plants, if you look at it, they're actually not an industry that requires foreshore facilities to carry out operations. But inevitably, our shoreline has seen a large number of thermal power plants. In Nagapattinam district, you have 6 proposed coal-fired power plants. You have 4 in Nellore. You have similarly 9 in Andhra Pradesh. You have a number of them. And they again come with serious environmental impacts in terms of coral bleaching, in terms of changes in fishes that you see, in the fish resources that you see around these ports, around these thermal power plants. And also another issue is nuclear power plants, which comes with an added issue of safety. And you see protests these days. You've seen the protests in Jaitapur. There are protests going on in Kudankulam against setting up of these sort of industries in their area. Tourism again is something that takes up a lot of coastal space in many areas. This is a picture from Puri in Orissa. So as you can see, the entire beach space has been taken up by these temporary shacks. And which brings us to the legal mess that exists in our coasts. Now, coasts themselves are a very dynamic space, and laws work best, or they're most easily implemented when things are black and white. Unfortunately, most issues in our country are not. There are various shades of grey. And the coast, well, the only certainty about the coastal system is that it's full of uncertainty. So you have a number of laws that exist in these spaces. You have the EPA, which is the mother law, and with the provision of which you have the CRZ, the EIA, and ecologically sensitive area notifications. You have the WLPA, you have Water Protection Act, you have Marine Fisheries Regulation Act. So there's many laws also which have already been discussed. And so I will skip this, but what I want to point out is in 1991, when the CRZ was first brought out, the idea was to regulate the sort of development activity that is happening on the coast. But with subsequent amendments, the strict protection that the CRZ gave was highly diluted. A lot of the amendments also were just postponing some of the deadlines that the original notification had. For example, there were several amendments postponing the deadline for phasing out sand mining in the Andaman Islands. And most of these amendments were brought out without any public consultation, because there is a provision in the EPA which says that if the ministry feels that it is in the public interest to do so, they can change existing notifications without a consultation process. And the ministry has taken good advantage of this provision to do that, to meet their own ends. And so now we are left with, we now have the new CRZ 2011 notification. And what I would like to point out here is the role that civil society and fisher organizations have played in ensuring that a number of the regressive amendments to the CRZ 1991 were not retained in the 2011. Of course, this is a half-won battle because a lot of amendments were legalized and are now existing, for example, projects of the Department of Atomic Energy. But a number of things like SEZs, like IT industries, service sector industries have been left out of the new CRZ 2011. So the CRZ 2011, similar to the 1991, is a zoning law. It divides the coast into different CRZ zones. It, of course, as we've already discussed, extends its ambit also to the territorial waters and not just the landward side. And this is just a quick example of the different exceptions. So if you look at the 1991, it said no industries except for those that require waterfront. If you look at 2011, there are 5 other things that are listed down, including the Department of Atomic Energy, including the Greenfield Airport here in Navi Mumbai. So as you can see, the initial notification has been diluted quite a bit. And the CRZ4, like I said, includes territorial waters. It also includes a CRZ5, which is areas requiring special consideration. And what I want to quickly mention here is the critically vulnerable coastal areas. So the CRZ 2011, they've tried to bring in a lot of provisions to increase the public participation, but the issue remains is that procedures for this are not detailed. So all that it says is that the CVs, the critically vulnerable coastal areas, have to be identified, planned, with guidelines, which is going to be developed by the MOEF in conjunction with stakeholders. But what is the procedure? When is this going to happen? Those details are not mentioned. And so again, I'll just skip over this because we've already discussed this. But district level committees is again an important provision brought about because of the pressure that groups have exerted to include local groups, local stakeholders within the decision-making process. So the CRZ has a provision for district-level committees that have 3 representatives from local traditional coastal communities, including fisherfolk, which is the terminology used. And also it gives you procedural details. So coming down to implementation of this law and the issues that we face. One is that it requires a number of baseline documents. Our friends from the government have already told us how difficult it is for common people to come and with these baseline documents to get permits, to get clearances. And you also, there is a great dependence on the EIA notification, and which has its own set of problems. The CZMAs play again a major role in implementation, and another important point is action taken on violations. So I'll go into these a little bit in detail. So for the CZMP preparation, one of the documents that you need is a coastal zone management plan, for which you need to demarcate your high tide line and your low tide line. Lines that vary, lines that are very difficult to accurately map. And the point is, the high tide line was supposed to be demarcated within 1 year of the notification. That deadline has passed. It's one of many deadlines that has passed. And till this new CZMP is prepared, you're supposed to depend on the CZMP prepared under the 1991 notification. So if you look at the history of that CZMP, in 1991 again they were given a deadline within which to complete the CZMP. None of the states met a deadline. In 1995 they were ordered by the court. A few states submitted it, they were rejected by the central government who asked to make changes. In 1996 the Indian Council for Enviro-Legal Action again approached the Supreme Court, filed a case saying that the states are not cooperating with the spirit of the CRZ. At which point the Supreme Court passed a clear order telling the states to submit these CZMPs within 3 months to the MOEF. It also told the MOEF not to give the CZMPs back to the states because, in its own words, it would be a futile exercise waiting for the states to make these corrections. But the MOEF, anyway, if you look at documents, what happened at that point was that the MOEF sent back these CZMPs asking them to make changes. So the CZMPs that are currently being used are conditionally approved on the understanding that a certain number of changes have to be made. And we filed RTIs asking the MOEF whether they do have these fully approved CZMPs with them. And the response we've got is that there are no records on, there are no documents on record as to whether the completely approved CZMP with the maps has been submitted. So what CZMP are we actually basing decisions all these years on is a question that remains. Again, the CRZ has a lot of deadlines. Discharge of untreated waste, which we've already talked about, is whether it's feasible, whether it's something that should be in there is a question left to be discussed. But the question also remains is that when you have these deadlines, what steps are being put in place to ensure that the states have the resources, have the funding, have the capabilities to meet the deadlines that have been imposed by the powers that be. Then moving on to the EIA, again, we've discussed this, so I'm not going to linger on this, but one point is that post-clearance monitoring and compliance is something that has been borrowed from the EIA and brought into the CRZ. But if you look at the EIA's history, if you, Kalpavriksha has brought out a report, there was also a workshop by CSC last year, and what we've seen is that out of all the projects cleared, if you look at 2003 alone, there were 223 projects cleared, and projects with monitoring reports that were given is 93. So above 90% compliance, only 7. So there is this history that we need to look back on and learn from, and try not to repeat the same mistakes again with the new law. CZMAs and public participation again is something that a lot of people have fought for, and what they asked for actually was representation at the state level and the central level. What they got was the district level, but we'll take what we get. Also, there's also another provision saying that treatment of sewage from coastal towns and cities, again the plan should be with stakeholders, but again no procedure, no details of that. And so we do have now this provision for district level committees, which ideally should ensure that the people living on the coast, the people that know the pressures that exist on the coast, the people who have a real stake in ensuring that their coastline is protected because it directly affects their day-to-day life. This particular provision has not been implemented in most states. Karnataka has district level committees. Tamil Nadu has not started that process. Similarly, Maharashtra has a district task force, which I think they're doubling as also district level committees. But what support these committees are getting, the CRZ makes no mention of what the role of the committee is, apart from saying that it will assist the state government. Assist in what way? What is their role? What is their responsibility? What powers do they have? These are questions that the CRZ remains mute on. And also action taken on violations. They were supposed to take action within a period of 8 months. Most states are still in the process of identifying violations. No actions have yet been taken. And states are also supposed to have a website to ensure transparency, to ensure public participation. States are supposed to have a dedicated website that gives you details on the CRZ's implementation, on violations and action taken. But there's a website information. While some states do have the website, this particular aspect of it in most states remains absent. And also we come to the practical difficulties now. We've already said that the CRZ, whatever changes have been made, a lot of the positive changes have been because of the influence of the public. Now if the public is going to continue to play the role of the watchdog, which they need to play in most environmental issues, they have to have some mechanism by which they can decide that something is wrong, something is right. And how are you going to prove that? In the case of the CRZ, you need 100 documents before you can prove that something is a violation. If a
Can we now conclude?
Oh, it's done. So, so the problems, as I said, to summarize, is the fact that a lot of amendments have been legalized. There are no finally approved CZMPs. There's a lot of ambiguity in a lot of the terms that have been used. Fishing communities have issue with the fact that you've said the traditional coastal communities, including fisher folks. So what does that mean? There's no consolidated document, and etc. etc. And there's also the fact that you have multiple interpretations. And so, just to conclude, the demands that various coastal communities and NGOs have put forth is one, they would like to revert to the 1995 notification without the amendments. This is something I think I'm not entirely sure how feasible that is, but that's something that has been put forth again and again. Taking stock and action against all CRZ violations on the coast, looking at the cumulative impact of existing pressure before you clear new projects, having a cumulative impact assessment, and recognizing the roles that local stakeholders and fishing communities can play and giving them the power to manage and monitor their coastal spaces and creating accountability, which is something that is sorely lacking.